It's the late 90s, and a brilliant teenager named Jonathan James is staring at his computer screen. In just a few clicks, he's infiltrated NASA, downloading software worth millions no one even knows yet. At 15, he pulls off a cybercrime that would make history, but it sets him on a path that leads to relentless suspicion and a devastating end. In the quiet suburbs of South Florida in the late 1990s, Jonathan James wasn't much different from any other teenager at first glance. He rode his bike down the neighborhood streets, hung out with friends, and had an average family life. But what set him apart was his fascination with computers. This was the age when personal computers were becoming household staples, and the internet, still clunky and slow by today's standards, offered a gateway to an entirely new world. For Jonathan, that gateway was irresistible. His first brush with computers started like it did for many kids who grew up in the 90s, hand-me-down machines and hours spent tinkering. But unlike a lot of people who casually explored the world of Windows or MS-DOS, Jonathan wasn't afraid to break things to figure out how they worked. Before long, he grew tired of the limitations of pre-installed software. He discovered Linux, an open-source operating system that would allow him to customize and control his machine in ways store-bought systems never could. The idea of open-source software, free to modify, free to share, excited him. It wasn't about convenience. It was about freedom, control, and curiosity. For someone fond of taking things apart to see what was inside, Linux was a revelation. Jonathan's curiosity quickly evolved into something much more ambitious. At an age when many kids were figuring out how to beat the latest level in their favorite video game, Jonathan James was figuring out how to bypass security systems. He excelled at identifying backdoors, ways to access parts of a system that weren't meant to be accessible. His approach was methodical, almost surgical, and he spent hours probing weaknesses in anything he could find. It became an obsession. The more control he took, the more he craved. One of his most infamous early exploits occurred when he managed to penetrate the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, a division of the Department of Defense. Using a system vulnerability, Jonathan gained access to usernames, passwords, and even employee emails. He was just 15 years old. To imagine someone that young breaking through government defenses, even in an era where cybersecurity wasn't as sophisticated as it is today, made this feat remarkable. What made it even more striking was that Jonathan didn't rush in recklessly, leaving obvious traces everywhere. He was meticulous. He knew how to cover his tracks and avoid detection for as long as possible. The DTRA hack was, for Jonathan, a proof of concept. A proof of concept. He had stepped into a larger world, one that only a small number of people had ever truly explored. This wasn't some kind of childish game anymore. It was real, and it showed him how far he could go, for a teenager with a rapidly growing skill set and an even faster growing confidence. The sky was beginning to look like the limit, or maybe even beyond the sky. What Jonathan didn't realize yet was that the government breach wouldn't be the defining moment of his hacking journey. It was a mere stepping stone. His talents were about to take him somewhere far more daring. Not satisfied with exploring behind the doors of the Department of Defense, Jonathan set his sights on arguably one of the most high-profile institutions in the world. Hacking the Pentagon was impressive. But hacking NASA? That was audacious. He was no longer just a kid tinkering with software. He was become a legend among those who knew his name, even before the wider world would ever hear it. For those paying attention, the DTRA breach was a signal that Jonathan wasn't any ordinary teenager with a hobby. But for him, it was just the beginning. What he was about to attempt next would force the world to take notice in a way he could never have anticipated. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama is where some of the nation's most secure and critical aerospace research takes place. At the time, this was the hub for developing the hardware, software, and systems that kept the International Space Station running. It was a place few could ever access, even digitally. The systems it housed were protected with some of the most advanced cybersecurity measures of the day. But to Jonathan James, it may as well have been an open invitation. The layers of protection represented a challenge he couldn't resist. Jonathan's approach to hacking NASA wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate and calculated. He identified vulnerabilities in the network, the kind of weak spots that often go unnoticed amidst an otherwise robust security system. Gaining access required patience, skill, and persistence. Once inside, Jonathan tapped into 13 computers connected to the center's network. These machines weren't random. They were integral to NASA's operations. By exploiting these systems, he was able to navigate deep into NASA's infrastructure, bypassing security protocols, permissions, and safeguards one at a time. Remember, he was just a teenager sitting in his bedroom, wielding little more than his wits and a computer. The magnitude of his success started to become clear when he managed to access software specifically tied to the International Space Station. What he downloaded wasn't some minor file or system log. It was source code valued at approximately $1.7 million. This code played a critical role in managing key elements of the station's functioning, from life support to control systems. The sheer daring of this act is hard to overstate. For someone outside the aerospace industry, this was not just complex software, but a culmination of decades of research and collaboration. Yet Jonathan managed to obtain it. To understand how significant this was, imagine what could happen if that source code fell into the wrong hands. Even though there's no evidence Jonathan ever planned to use the code maliciously, its potential misuse raised massive concerns. Would another adversary learn the same things Jonathan had? What if someone could exploit the code to interfere with the International Space Station? The breach sent shockwaves through one of the world's most powerful organizations. NASA responded swiftly but cautiously. The systems Jonathan had access were too critical to leave online while they figured out what had happened. So, for 21 days, operations at the Marshall Space Flight Center ground to a halt. Engineers and cybersecurity professionals worked around the clock to assess the damage, tighten their defenses, and ensure no further incursions could take place. The downtime cost the agency $41,000 in delays, a significant sum, even by NASA standards. But it wasn't just about the money. It was a wake-up call regarding their own vulnerability, a crisis no one had expected to come from a 15-year-old. This breach wasn't just an internal embarrassment for NASA. It also turned the spotlight on the broader challenges of cybersecurity during a time when the internet was still relatively young. Agencies like NASA and the Department of Defense prided themselves on being virtually untouchable. The idea that a boy sitting in a South Florida bedroom could tear through multiple levels of digital defenses was inconceivable to many. Yet it exposed something critical about the evolving landscape. There was no such thing as a completely secure system. No firewall, password, or encryption could stop a mind creative enough to find the gaps. Jonathan's hack wasn't motivated by greed or malice to find the gaps. Jonathan's hack wasn't motivated by greed or malice. By all accounts, he wasn't trying to sell the source code or even gain a financial advantage. But it's hard to categorize his actions as harmless curiosity. By stepping into the systems of one of the world's most important scientific agencies, he crossed the line. This wasn't just exploration. He had breached sensitive government property. Though he was only a teenager, his ambition came with massive consequences, both for himself and the organizations he infiltrated. For Jonathan, this moment became the defining point of his hacking career. In the hacker community, he was already gaining notoriety, but this bold move elevated him to legend status. But it also marked a pivotal shift. Up until this point, his exploits had drawn little attention outside of the agencies he targeted. His incursion into NASA brought him into the crosshairs of federal authorities for the first time. The government was now watching, and they were determined to bring whoever was behind this to justice. When investigators began connecting the dots, they found themselves staring at an unlikely culprit. A kid barely old enough to drive had breached top-tier security systems. While this revelation shocked them, it also raised questions about the broader system. How could something like this happen? And more importantly, what would they do about it? The answer to that wasn't just about punishing Jonathan. It had the potential to change the way cybercrime involving minors was handled in the future. This breach may have cemented Jonathan's reputation, but it also sealed his fate. The federal authorities were closing in, and soon, his life would take a turn he could never have anticipated. For now, though, he was still just a teenager sitting at his computer, perhaps unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. When federal investigators arrived at Jonathan James's doorstep, it was clear the trail led directly to him. Faced with evidence tying him to breaches at both the Department of Defense and NASA, his options were limited. Jonathan chose to cooperate, ultimately pleading guilty. By doing so, he became the first minor in U.S. history convicted of cybercrime, a distinction that carried weight far beyond his 15 years. At his trial, the seriousness of his actions stood alongside the undeniable reality of his age. He wasn't a seasoned hacker or part of an organized crime ring. He was a kid, one who had managed to outwit two of the most secure organizations in the country. The judge chose a measured approach, sentencing Jonathan to 6 months of house arrest, a probationary period, and a complete prohibition on using a computer unless it was for school. To some, this punishment seemed too light. Critics argued that it sent the wrong message, suggesting that even high-stakes cybercrime could escape serious repercussions if the offender was young enough. To others, the sentence showed how difficult it was to balance accountability with rehabilitation when dealing with minors. Jonathan wasn't just any teenager, though. He had displayed a level of ingenuity and intelligence that few adults could match. Yet at the same time, he had shown judgment that, in many ways, reflected his age. How do you punish someone like that without destroying their potential? The court, likely recognizing this, seemed to err on the side of leniency. But some would argue the approach didn't go far enough to steer him away from trouble. For Jonathan, being banned from computers wasn't just a limitation. It was a form of isolation. He had spent years building his world around programming, exploration, and digital challenges. The sudden removal of that outlet left a vacuum in his life. During his house arrest, his frustration seemed to grow. It wasn't just the punishment itself that weighed on him, but also the attention. By now, the media had caught wind of his story. To the public, he was no longer Jonathan James. He was C0 Maraid, his online alias, and the teen who hacked NASA. His real identity became inseparable from his digital one, and with that came a level of scrutiny he wasn't prepared to handle. After completing house arrest, it didn't take long for Jonathan to find himself in trouble again. His return to freedom didn't come with the fresh start one might expect. Without the computers that had once consumed his time, he began to drift. He fell into a crowd involved with drugs, eventually leading to charges of drug possession. In this case, the courts weren't as lenient. Jonathan was sentenced to 6 months in a juvenile detention center. It was a far cry from his life at home, secluded in front of a glowing monitor, exploring the depths of cyberspace. His time in juvenile detention marked a turning point, but not one of redemption. Instead, it added another layer of difficulty to an already precarious life. The challenges of returning to society were compounded by his growing notoriety and the stigma of his criminal history. Employers, teachers. Peers all saw him through the lens of his past, making it nearly impossible for him to move forward. Even after serving his time, Jonathan found himself unable to escape the shadow of what he had done, or, more often, what others thought he was still capable of. The rapid rise of cybercrime during these years also meant that law enforcement remained skeptical of him long after his conviction. As hacking became more sophisticated and damaging, Jonathan's earlier actions took on new implications. Criminal behavior online wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It had evolved into a global, multi-billion-dollar threat. For someone carrying the label of a prodigious hacker, suspicion followed him everywhere. Even in his attempts to keep a low profile after his legal troubles, the world always seemed ready to pin the next major breach on him, whether there was evidence or not. Looking at Jonathan's case in the broader context raises tough questions about how society deals with young offenders in the digital age. In situations like his, the response has to address not only the crime committed but also the potential for rehabilitation. But how do you rehabilitate someone for whom the system itself has become a permanent cage? Jonathan wasn't a violent criminal. He wasn't a danger to society in the traditional sense. Yet his actions placed him at the center of debates about justice, accountability, and even the ethics of punishment. For someone as young as he was, carrying that burden came at a cost. Even after finishing his sentences, Jonathan remained haunted by this legacy. Forgetting wasn't an option. Attempts to reintegrate into a normal life were met with skepticism at every turn. He was brilliant but branded, a talent seen as both a gift and a threat. Over time, the weight of this dual identity began to take its toll. His ability to log off from his past, both literally and metaphorically, was something he could never achieve. However, the fallout from Jonathan's actions wasn't finished shaping his life or his reputation. His story was far from over, but its trajectory seemed increasingly grim. What comes next is not just a continuation of a legal battle, but the slow unraveling of a bright, troubled mind under the strain of notoriety, suspicion, and a world that refused to let him break free. After Jonathan James served his sentence, he tried to carve out a life outside the world of hacking. Away from computers and under the constraints of probation, he lived a quiet, almost reclusive existence. But the consequences of his actions had left a mark that couldn't be erased. While he avoided the spotlight, his reputation followed him everywhere. To law enforcement, and even to some in the hacker community, he remained a person of interest. A brilliant but untrustworthy figure. Although Jonathan appeared to step away from illicit activities, suspicion lingered, casting a shadow over everything he did. In 2007, that suspicion came into sharp focus. The TJX Companies, a multinational retailer, reported one of the largest data breaches in history at the time. Hackers had stolen sensitive credit and debit card information from tens of millions of customers. The breach sent shockwaves through cybersecurity circles and landed on the radar of federal investigators. Jonathan James's name came up, not because of any direct evidence, but because his past exploits made him a prime suspect in high-profile cases like this. For many in law enforcement, it was easier to believe that a known hacker like Jonathan, someone with the skills to execute such an operation, must have been involved. Jonathan denied any involvement, but the scrutiny was relentless. Investigators raided his house, searching for evidence that could link him to the TJX hack. They seized his computers and personal belongings, fumbling through his digital life for clues. Despite their efforts, they found nothing concrete tying him to the breach, yet the suspicion alone was enough to pull him back into the public eye, and back into the orbit of law enforcement. For someone who had tried to move on, this renewed attention was suffocating. The pressure Jonathan faced was not just external. Internally, he struggled with the weight of what he had done, what he had been accused of, and what he believed the world saw him as, a criminal. While his actions as a teenager had brought him notoriety, they had also brought isolation. The same systems that once gave him a sense of control and power now felt like they had turned on him. Unable to shake his past, Jonathan became increasingly withdrawn. Friends and family noticed the tension in him, the anxiety that seemed to build as the suspicion around him grew. In the hacker community, his fall from grace was met with mixed reactions. Some saw him as a tragic figure, burned by the very skills that had once defined him. Others questioned whether Jonathan had truly walked away from hacking at all. Rumors circulated that he might still be operating under different aliases, though there was little evidence to support these claims. The speculation only added to the perception that Jonathan James was, and would always be, entangled in the world of cybercrime. These assumptions had a cumulative effect. Even if there was no basis for them, they added to the isolation Jonathan felt. It didn't matter if he was innocent or guilty. What mattered was the label he couldn't shake. A hacker, a criminal, a prodigy turned pariah. The isolation eroded him over time, chipping away at both his mental health and his ability to trust others. The freedom he had once sought through hacking now seemed like a cage he couldn't escape. By 2008, the pressure had reached a breaking point. On May 18th, Jonathan James was found dead in his home. He had taken his own life at just 25 years old. In a chilling suicide note, he expressed despair over the constant watchfulness of law enforcement and his inability to clear his name. He wrote, "I honestly have nothing to do with TJX. I have no faith in the justice system. Perhaps my actions today and this letter will send a stronger message to the public. Either way." Not known saying how was status shady kabid festival the gloster. Joe that goes one yet. Azish, den Wenale, Jazen, Jawas Gazide, that is Scheisse. Death sent shockwaves through both the hacker community and the organizations that had once pursued him. Officially ruled a suicide, his death still prompted whispers of deeper conspiracies. Some speculated that Jonathan had been silenced, perhaps because of what he knew or what he might have done. Others saw it as the tragic culmination of years of suspicion and mistrust, a reflection of a system ill-equipped to deal with someone like him. Whether theory or fact, the circumstances surrounding his death only deepened his mythos, turning Jonathan James from a prodigy into something of a martyr. His death raised important questions that lingered long after the headlines faded. How should society treat brilliant minds who cross ethical boundaries? For Jonathan, his talents went unchecked, and his punishment, though seemingly light, ended up isolating him in ways that amplified the worst parts of his struggles. Could things have gone differently if someone had nurtured his genius, channeling it into legitimate pursuits rather than criminal exploits? Or was he doomed the moment he logged into his first forbidden system? Jonathan's legacy is a bittersweet one. He's remembered as a cautionary tale, a genius who fell too quickly and too deeply into a world with no safety net. His tragic end forces us to examine not just how we define punishment, but how we offer redemption, especially for those who show extraordinary potential. The story of C0 Mraid, the boy who hacked NASA, didn't end with brilliance, it ended with silence. But the echoes of his life and the questions it leaves behind remain just as loud as ever. Jonathan James's story sits at the uneasy crossroads of genius and consequence. His teenage curiosity revealed vulnerabilities in some of the most secure systems in the world, challenging what we thought was invulnerable. But his gift for hacking wasn't met with guidance. It was met with punishment, isolation, and ultimately despair. It raises a difficult question. How do we channel extraordinary young minds toward creation rather than destruction? Society often reacts with fear to those who break the rules, who break the rules, who break the rules. But what if we fostered their potential instead? Imagine what someone like Jonathan could have built if his talents had been truly nurtured.